made it. This is the last video for this unit, or video lecture for this unit. In this unit, we're going to talk about control measures for reducing worker exposure to radiation in the workplace. A lot of the same procedures, like I've said before, a lot of the same safety management procedures that we use for other hazards applies to radiation hazards as well. You know, we conduct hazard analyses, evaluations of the workplace hazards, we conduct risk assessments, we develop exposure control plans. In addition, though, to talking about control measures, I'm going to also cover a few loose ends, some concepts, some, I think, useful information that you need to have some exposure to in this last video. But our focus is, again, on the control measures. Radiation, let me back up just a second before I talk about these control measures. Ideally, we can remove radiation from our work processes if possible. That's not going to be possible in a lot of workplaces where radiation is present. But if we can eliminate the radiation, eliminate that energy, that is going to be the best protection for the workers. Now, there is one real good example in the medical field where newer technology is starting to replace some of the older technology. Some newer technology that doesn't use radiation is replacing older technology that does rely on radiation. The MRI machine, the magnetic resonance imaging machines that are used, becoming more and more common. They've been around for a long time, but they're becoming more and more used as imaging tools in the medical field. They're not a source of radiation. They do not use radioactive materials for the images they produce. So an MRI has been a tool that has eliminated a lot of the use of traditional X-rays or CAT scans that do rely on radioactive materials that do produce radiation when they are used. So if we can, we eliminate radiation, but a lot of times that's not going to be possible. So if it's not possible to eliminate radiation in the workplace, we can use different shielding strategies. We put a shield between the worker and the radiation source. We can increase distance between the worker and the radiation source. Radiation is one of those, or is a phenomenon that follows the law of inverse squares. The law of inverse squares does apply to radiation energy. We talked about the law of inverse squares in 3423 when we talked about sound and noise in the workplace. I'm not going to talk a lot about it here, but I am going to refer to that video if anyone would like to go back and get a refresher, or maybe you haven't covered law of inverse squares before in other classes. But distance, very simply stated, distance is an important tool that we can use to protect workers from radiation in the workplace. Time, reduce the worker's time of exposure through job rotation, have time-based excursion limits. We limit the amount of time that workers are exposed to these sources of radiation. And finally, we may have to resort to personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment is lowest on our hierarchy of controls. We only use it as a last resort, but there are times when it's the only resort. That's the only option we have. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these, just very briefly, as we talk about controlling exposure to radiation. Again, pardon me, I'm getting pretty tired now. I think this might be a record for the most videos I've made in a day, number 7. Now, I've probably made more than that one day, but again, it's been a long day. So please be kind in your judgment of this video. Again, control measures, shielding. With shielding, we're talking about material which encloses the source that's between the worker and the source. Now, the effectiveness of the different shielding possibilities comes down to the type of radiation that's involved and the shielding material. Shielding materials could be wood, steel, lead, concrete, and even water. Water is a very effective shield if it's possible to use water as shielding. And I mentioned that in one of our earlier videos in the unit. So type of radiation, the material, then the thickness of the shielding material. The thickness of the shielding material is referred to as the half-value layer. The half-value layer is the thickness of material needed to reduce radiation by 1/2. And here's an example of the half-value layer for different materials, or the half-value, or the half-value thickness for different materials. Again, it depends on the source of the radiation, the type of the radiation. If we're shielding gamma rays, and we have two different radioisotopes emitting gamma rays, we have a radium-192 and cobalt-60. These are the half-value layer, or the half-value thicknesses for concrete materials, steel, lead, and tungsten. The lower the HVL value that we have here, the better the shielding effectiveness. And these values are in inches. For tungsten, if we're dealing with iridium-192, it only takes 13/100ths of an inch to reduce the radiation energy from iridium-192 by 1/2. So 13/100ths of an inch of tungsten will reduce the radiation energy from iridium-192 by 1/2. So let's say, again, I'm just throwing hypothetical numbers out here. Let's say the radiation energy coming off iridium was 100. A shield of tungsten that was 13/100ths of an inch thick would reduce that energy to 50, would cut it in half. For lead, it would take 19/100ths of an inch to reduce the energy in half. For steel, it would take a full half-inch steel plate to reduce the energy coming off the iridium by 1/2. For concrete, which is the least effective, it would take 1 3/4 inches to reduce the energy by 1/2. Now for cobalt-60, we see these half-value layers, the values increased. Cobalt-60, different source of energy. Again, it goes back to the source type and type of radiation. For cobalt-60, it takes 31/100ths of an inch to reduce the energy by 1/2. Again, for the iridium, it only took 13/100ths of an inch. But for the cobalt-60, it took 31/100ths of an inch. Lead, about a 1/2 inch, 49/100ths of an inch of lead to reduce the energy by 1/2 if we're dealing with cobalt-60. Steel, 85/100ths of an inch. And for concrete, it took 2.38 inches of concrete to reduce the energy coming off the cobalt by 1/2. Again, water is commonly used. It's a shield that's used in nuclear power plants. It does require a greater thickness. So because it requires such a great thickness, it is not practical in many applications. We do see it used as a shield in nuclear power plants quite often. So this is an example of shielding and half-value layer, or half-value thicknesses of different materials used to shield different sources of radiation. Now, if we're talking about X-ray shielding, lead or concrete is commonly used. And what we have here in this table is the shielding thickness required for these materials at different levels of electrical energy. Intensity of X-ray radiation is a function of the electrical power that's charging the X-ray tubes. So more kilovolts, here we have 50 kilovolts, 100 kilovolts, more kilovolts, more electrical energy, more radiation, and it requires a thicker layer of the material to reduce the energy by 1/2. So if we're using lead and we have 50 kilovolts of electrical energy that's charging the X-ray tubes, it takes 0.002 inches of lead to reduce the energy by 1/2 at 50 kilovolts. At 50 kilovolts for concrete, it takes 17 hundredths of an inch. If we go up to 100 volts of electrical energy charging the X-ray tubes, then it's 1/100th of an inch of lead, 0.595 inches of concrete. So lead's the more effective shield, as we see here. If we go all the way out to 1,000 kilovolts or 1,000,000 volts, it's a lot of volts, it takes 1.75 inches of concrete and about 31/100ths of an inch of lead to reduce the X-ray energy by 1/2. Again, half value. Let's go. I want to make sure we understand this. I'm not going to ask you questions. You're not going to have to remember any of these numbers, but I do want you to remember the concept here. The half value layer is the thickness of material needed to reduce radiation by 1/2. Common materials: concrete, steel, and lead, tungsten occasionally. Shielding is effective. If we're not able to implement a shield, we might be able to use distance as a protective measure. Radiation adheres to the law of inverse squares, which simply says that the energy intensity decreases as the distance from the source increases. More precisely, it says the intensity decreases in proportion to the square of the distance. And I'm not going to go into a lot more detail here, but if you want to watch another video, I'll mention that video on the next slide. Again, intensity divided by the square of the distance from the source, applicable to several physical phenomena, including magnetism, light energy, and radiation. Energy from a point source. The way this works, the energy from a point source is diluted. It spreads out over a larger distance. As it spreads out over a larger distance, as it gets further and further away from that source, it spreads out, the intensity is decreased. And this diagram here illustrates that nicely. If this is our point source, let's say this is our radiation source right here, as that radiation is emitted away from the source, it becomes more dispersed. As it becomes more dispersed, it's losing energy. So the energy all the way out here is 1/16. This, let's say this is 4 feet, 1 feet, 2 feet, 3 feet from the source. At 4 feet from the source, the energy is 1/16 of what it was at the source, because of this dispersion, that's the spreading of the energy, this diluting of the energy that's taking place. If you would like a better explanation, a more detailed explanation of the law of inverse squares, I encourage you to take a look at this video. It's from Safety Management 3423, and specifically we're focusing on sound levels and distance, but I give you a pretty good explanation of the law of inverse squares. And I don't think I was half asleep when I did this video, so it might be a little more clear if you take a look at this video. Not required. The main thing I want you to understand from this discussion is that the law of inverse squares has to do with the decrease in energy that's associated with distance from the primary source. Time is another way of limiting exposure, protecting workers. We didn't talk about this earlier when we talked about dose, but dose is really a function of dose rate times time. If we can limit the exposure time, we can decrease the dose. Let's say we have this circumstance here. A worker must perform a task in an area where the dosimeter is indicating a dose rate of 10 millirem per hour. The task will take 3 hours for the worker to complete. So at the conclusion of that 3-hour period, they're going to have a 30 millirem accumulated exposure. 30 millirem accumulated exposure. In this circumstance that I'm giving you here, the company policy limits workers' daily dosage to 20 millirems per day. So in this circumstance, there's a problem. The way we fix this problem is by limiting the workers' exposure time. We can use work rotation, job, task rotation, whatever term you want to use, to reduce the exposure. We can share this task between 2 or more workers to limit the exposure. Instead of having one worker in here for 3 hours, have 2 workers that are in there exposed in that area for 1.5 hours. First guy does his 1.5 hours, the second worker comes in, they do 1.5 hours. They are going to be under the company policy, the company standard of 20 millirem total exposure during the workday. So limiting the amount of time of exposure can be an effective way to keep workers safe, to keep them within, to keep them under exposure limits. Another method that can be used to protect workers is the use of personal protective equipment. Again, I've mentioned it's a last resort. Routes of exposure for radiation energy can be skin penetration, inhalation, and ingestion. There are a variety of devices to protect workers from exposure by skin, penetration, inhalation, or ingestion. One thing to keep in mind about radiation-rated PPE, it does wear out. It's not for long-term protection. It's for temporary protection. It temporarily limits exposure. Shielding, distance, time, those methods are going to offer the best protection. But there may be instances where we can't shield, we can't increase distance, and we can't decrease exposure time. So that's where PPE would come into play. And there are a lot of different personal protective devices available. For some types of radiation, simple clothing may be enough. Gloves, balaclavas, glass will prevent most alpha and beta particle penetration. They don't have a lot of penetrating power. For sources of energy, types of radiation that have greater penetrating power, we might have to have specialty clothing, such as clothing like we see in the picture here. A lead-lined smock or a vest or something along those lines. You might also have personal protective devices that protect specific target organs. They are target or organ-specific protection. Here are some different examples here. We have safety glasses. The lenses are lead infused. There's lead in those lenses. That protects workers from radiation exposure affecting their eyes, the development of cataracts, for example. We have a variety of gloves or hand protection that's available. We have hand protection here, hand protection here. We have protective smock to protect the worker's torso all the way down to his knees. Again, the groin area, the gonads area, that's an area highly susceptible to radiation injury. It's protected with a smock like this. We have full body protection provided here. Not the face, there's not a face covering in place here, but provides basically full body protection with that ensemble. Then we have a protective collar. The thyroid is another organ that is highly susceptible to injury from radiation. These protective collars are designed to protect the thyroid from radiation exposure. We also have to be concerned about inhalation or ingestion. Alpha and beta particles. Alpha particles, they don't penetrate much, but they can be very damaging, and they damage when they're inhaled or ingested. There are respirator cartridges like the CBRN cartridges that are designed to protect workers from the inhalation of radioactive particles. And a respirator with the correct cartridge could be used to protect workers from inhalation and ingestion. To protect from ingestion, it needs to be a full face that covers the mouth as well as the nasal passages. Speaking of the CBRN respirators, this is a type of respirator cartridge that will pretty much protect workers from any hazard. I don't want to say any hazard, but a lot of the more serious hazards. Chemical, biological, radiation, and nuclear protection. That's what the CBRN stands for. Chemical, biological, radiation, and nuclear hazards. And we will talk more about respirators and CBRN cartridges later in the semester. We'll have a one unit that's just on respiratory protection. If you would like to learn a little bit more about different protective devices, this is a site that I found that has some useful information. It focuses more on emergency medical management that may be needed when there's radiation exposure. And here's a full coverage ensemble. He's got the lead infused shield, the respirator, full body coverage. That's even with all of this, there's not perfect protection, but this is about as good as it can get as far as protection from radiation. Just as kind of a side note, when you take ASP, CSP exams, you might see a question that where you have this symbol and ask you what this symbol indicates, what's represented by this symbol. If you see this symbol, this is a symbol for radiation hazard. And there's a lot of different forms of it, but if you see this basic symbol, this basic configuration here, that is indicative of a radiation hazard. Now, in workplaces where there are radiation hazards, it's going to be more than just this basic symbol. There'll actually be some wording normally that spells out radiation hazard or radioactive material, something along those lines. All right, that's a quick and very dirty coverage of protective measures that can be implemented to protect workers from radiation exposure. Some additional issues, some concepts and terminology I want to share with you I think may come in handy. If not in the workplace, could come in handy on certification exams. One industry activity we didn't talk about when I talked about some different industries and radiation exposure. Oil and gas exploration, that's a big deal in Oklahoma and this region of the world. Radioactive materials can be used in the production of oil and gas and the recovery of oil and gas from the earth, from the geological structures where it's found. Radioactive materials are injected and deposited into the earth to help better understand the geologic structures and map those geologic structures, which again is that mapping, that understanding of what's under the ground is very important in oil exploration and the oil exploration side of the oil and gas industry. And radioactive materials, tracers used in oil and gas exploration. A couple of acronyms that you may run into. TNORM. TNORM stands for Technological Enhanced Naturally Occurring Radioactive Materials. NORM, naturally occurring radioactive materials like radon and cosmic radiation. All right, just a few additional issues on this particular subject, issues that we're not going to talk about, but later in your career, if you end up working with radioactive materials or in environments where there is exposure to radiation, you'll want to study more about medical treatment, decontamination when workers are exposed, nuclear waste disposal and storage. When I teach the hazardous waste class, I talk a little bit about nuclear waste disposal, but not in any great detail. Nuclear contamination, like we have at the Rocky Flats facility in the Denver, Colorado area. And there is an interesting little video if you'd like to take a look at that. This is one of the most contaminated areas in the United States when we're talking about contamination with radioactive materials. They've done a really good job of restoring that area, but it's still kind of sketchy. I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time at Rocky Flats, at the Rocky Flats site. Then finally, emergency management as it applies to incidents involving radiation, radioactive materials. That would be something that you would want to study in more detail, especially if you end up working in an industry where radiation is a concern. All right, that brings us to the end of this unit. One more thing I do want to mention. If you are looking forward in the future to taking the CSP exam, you might want to check out this YouTube video that I have. This YouTube video it contains several problems and talks about different methods for radiation calculations. I will have this linked in Blackboard if anybody wants to take a look at it. It is optional. There's no calculations on this quiz. There's no calculations in this unit. Let me know if you have any questions.